There's a sort of human tendency to flail when you're stuck. Humans are amazing, and with enough adrenaline, we can do incredible things. Unfortunately, that same adrenaline is counterproductive when you're trying to be thoughtful and strategic and considered about your next step. One of the reasons being stuck is so overwhelming to people is that it feels very personal and very idiosyncratic and unusual, whereas in fact, it is universal. And realizing that is really the first step towards dealing with the emotional component of being stuck and then getting past it. 98 to 99% of the time, I failed. She didn't get past the interview. She didn't get where she was hoping to get. And that's, I think, a really important message, that even people who are dramatically successful, like Ed Sheeran, like Brie Larson, are failing 98 to 99% of the time. I think that's important for two reasons. One is because it makes the rest of us feel better when we fail. That's normal even for successful people. But it also demonstrates the importance of persevering through those failures, because if you're going to succeed, it's going to come at the cost of many failures.
Welcome to the Performance Initiative Podcast.
Our goal is to provide you and ourselves with the tools to be the best versions of ourselves.
We are your hosts, Dr. Grant Cooper
and Dr. Zinovy Meyler. We just wrapped up a conversation with Adam Alter.
Adam has answers for a lot of really interesting questions, like, have you ever been stuck and not known how to get unstuck?
Also, why people are more likely to make drastic life change at 39 rather than 41.
Have you wondered if people who are 50 years old make for good or bad entrepreneurs?
Why shouldn't you trust first several ideas for a baby name or for a business name?
And there's no one better to be talking to about these and a lot of other interesting questions than Adam Alter. Adam is a professor of marketing at New York University Stern School of Business and the Robert Stansky Teaching Excellence Faculty Fellow with an affiliated appointment in the New York University Psychology Department. He's the author of multiple New York Times best-selling books. He's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Wired, Slate, Huffington Post, Popular Science, among many other publications. He shared his ideas with NPR's Fresh Air at the Cannes Lions Festival of Creativity and with dozens of companies like Google, Microsoft, Anheuser-Busch. You get the picture. Adam is the real deal. He is extremely knowledgeable, a great storyteller, and just chock-a-block with really interesting information that's both pressingly useful, and it makes you really think about where you are in life and where you want to be.
Yep. Great conversationalist, great storyteller, many, many takeaways.
Enjoy. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much for taking the time to have the conversation. It seems like one of the central theses of your book, Anatomy of a Breakthrough, is that we all see successful people and we tend to think that they've always been successful and they've never had any real struggles.
And now with social media at play and its ability to edit out any struggles and failures, it seems only natural that someone starts and then has brilliant success as the very next step.
Right. And then when we all go through life and we inevitably get stuck at different points, we think that something's wrong with us.
Right. And then social media comes in and then we compare our experience to that experience, and with those unrealistic expectations. And it seems that then it drives us to either give up or be really frustrated.
Right. But actually getting stuck, it turned out, is not only a natural part of the process, but sometimes getting stuck is a necessary part of the process in order to make a creative breakthrough. So first of all, do we have that about right?
That's an amazing summary. I should have just brought you both in to write the book's prologue. That's exactly right. I think one of the central issues with being human is that so much of what is important and central to our own lives is hidden from us in other people. And so we always assume that our experience is unusual and often more negative than what other people experience. And that's certainly true with stuckness. That if you think about what the media devotes time to, what ends up being discussed by people, it's always the best businesses, the Academy Award winners, the best athletes. We devote a lot of ink and time to great successes. And you only start paying attention to these people once they become successful, because there are billions of people behind them who are striving. We don't spend that much time on striving. We spend a lot of time on the outcome. And so that is a central idea, that one of the reasons being stuck is so overwhelming to people is that it feels very personal and very idiosyncratic and unusual, whereas in fact it is universal. And realizing that is really the first step towards dealing with the emotional component of being stuck and then getting past it.
Yeah. I think it's by partly also people are drawn to celebrities that they see, always being successful, expressing their personal struggles and, that it wasn't always smooth sailing, that they also went through difficulties.
Yeah, I think that's right. it's disarming when that happens. It happens maybe less frequently than it should, but when it does, it's notable. And I think we feel a sense of connection with the people who are willing to do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's also, I remember seeing Ed Sheeran, I think, share his earlier recordings and how good he sounded for a complete amateur, but how
I didn't catch that, but that's a great
from where he is now. So it's very,
I've
very
seen some
moving.
of those videos. It's a really good example of that kind of thing. And I was searching for examples of that and began the book by talking about Brie Larson, the actress, because she has this example that is really so, I think, so powerful, where she spends a lot of time on 2 YouTube videos, basically going through every single failed audition, movie that she didn't get into. She's ultimately a massive success commercially and critically. But I mean, as she says, 98 to 99% of the time, I fail. She
Right.
didn't get past the interview. She didn't get where she was hoping to get. And that's, I think, a really important message, that even people who are dramatically successful, like Ed Sheeran, like Brie Larson, are failing 98 to 99% of the time. I think that's important for 2 reasons. One is because it makes the rest of us feel better when we fail. That's normal even for successful people. But it also demonstrates the importance of persevering through those failures, because if you're going to succeed, it's going to come at the cost of many failures, and that's okay and natural and normal.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, in terms of getting stuck, how do you know when you're stuck, and are you stuck at times without even realizing that you're in sort of a sticking point?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've thought a lot about this. I mean, there are, I think, 2 ways of thinking about stuckness. And the one is, it's one of those human experiences that is visceral, that you can report, that you feel. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So I have a friend whose father is a mathematician, was a mathematician. He spent many years working on a single big problem. It's one of the big problems that the world's mathematicians were wrestling with. And he spent 30 years on this problem, and he didn't make any measurable progress. So from the outside looking in, my friend said to his dad, "You must be deeply upset a lot of the time. This seems frustrating. You seem stuck from the outside. Objectively, you're not making measurable progress on this problem. And that's your everything. That's like all of your work is about this problem." And his dad said to him, "Every day I'm engaged, I'm engrossed. I feel like I'm making incremental steps in the right direction. And when I hit a dead end, I try again, I try something different. And actually at no point do I feel frustrated or stuck." So you can be stuck. You can be objectively stuck where you're not making measurable progress, but feel very good about how things are moving. And that's what this mathematician expressed. But you can also be in a situation where it looks like things are moving forward quite freely, and you feel stuck. You don't feel like things are moving in the direction you'd like. And I think that's the important thing, is subjectively speaking, not objectively, but subjectively, do you feel like you are stuck? Are you frustrated? Are you unhappy in a particular area of your life? And if you are, and you want to be somewhere else, then you're stuck.
Yeah.
Another way to look at stuckness, though, is to say what's objective matters, and sometimes it's hidden from us. So if I'm someone who's in a particular job or in a particular relationship or have particular friendships, and I feel like they're working out okay, but actually from the outside, it turns out they're not moving in the direction they should be. Maybe there are metrics that could demonstrate that, or maybe some wise third party could show me that that's true. And then maybe it's revealed to you that you're stuck despite the fact that you don't recognize it. So I think stuckness can be quite complicated. Most of the time, I think it's clear to us that we're stuck, but there are times when we're stuck and we don't even realize it.
Yeah. The issue with the mathematician, we have Lawrence Krauss is coming on later. And so I'm reading this book about the cosmos. And one of the things that because he sort of talks about the evolution of the sciences. And so some of the, greatest scientists, they spent 30 years working on a problem, and then they have a breakthrough. But some of the scientists were working in the wrong direction. They spent 30 years trying to prove something, getting stuck, and then realizing this is a dead end. Like the science went in the totally opposite direction. How do you know when you should not just say I'm stuck and I need to work through it, but I'm stuck and I'm going in the wrong direction, so I need to, maybe move on to something else?
Yeah, so I think the one interesting thing, and what this mathematician suggested, and what these people who work in the wrong direction, I think, suggest, is that it's really important to decide what matters to you. Is it the journey that you're on and the day-to-day experience of what it's like to be on that journey, whether or not you're headed in the right direction? If you're on a road trip, you're driving in the opposite direction from where you want to be. Are you having fun during the road trip, or is the fact that you're going in the wrong direction paramount? Right. And so it actually, the fun in the moment doesn't matter because you're going the wrong way. For some people, that outcome is what matters. And for other people, it's just the enjoyment of the journey. So I think that's a really big part of it. But if you are someone who cares about heading in the right direction, that's, I think, the question you're asking. How do you know you're headed in the right direction? And I think that's tricky, and it's very domain dependent. So in some domains, you get objective feedback. If you're trying to learn a language, you know if you're stuck because, for example, if you measure across time, especially if you're using, say, a language learning app, your vocabulary was going up and then it sort of hit a plateau and you're not improving in your ability to speak or learn the language or read the language or whatever matters to you. And so you have wonderful objective feedback that shows you that at one point you were converging on the goal and now you're diverging from the goal or you've hit a plateau. That's great. Most domains don't work that way. Most of the domains that really matter to people, unless it's about how much money you have where you can look at dollar amounts or how many words you learn, there's not an objective yardstick. And so then I think you either have to create some metric that is objective and measurable that you can use. And sometimes it's something you've got to cobble together. You've got to think about what matters in that particular domain, even if there isn't something like dollar amounts or numbers of words spoken, but something that over time you can track. And then you track it. You see whether you're getting closer to where you want to be. But in other domains, it's really subjective. It's totally, day to day. If I think about, say you're a young person who's dating and you're trying to decide if this is a person you should spend your life with, and you're not sure if you're stuck in that relationship or if it's progressing. There is no metric that does that for you. You don't measure how many times you held hands or whatever. That's not going to do the job. But you got to have something. So what you could do is you could track across time. Does this feel like it's moving in the right direction? And I think that's just a useful thing to do. And a lot of getting unstuck is this metacognition, this overarching sense of how things are progressing.
And the difficulty, I guess, with some of these domains, as you mentioned, is the fact that the experience changes you. So as you're going in and whatever goals you're setting, they're no longer necessarily going to be the same goals that you're going to go to as you're going through the experience. Almost like quantum physics, when it's observed, it changes, and so that makes it even more difficult, right, to know whether you're stuck because all of those variables.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge part of it. That you think about careers. We have this idea. I think when we go to college or when you're in school, that things are much smoother than they actually turn out to be. That there's a linearity to life that just isn't represented in the way people actually live. And so as you pursue goals, you, for example, are exposed to new things that you didn't even realize existed. Say you're doing some degree. There's a degree of specialization that might happen later on in your life, whether it's medicine, whether it's any other degree, whether it's law, doesn't matter what you're doing. You learn things about yourself as you're on the journey towards the goal, and that might shift what you think the goal is and might change your orientation. And so that further complicates things. Maybe you were converging on the goal you thought was your goal. Now you have a new one and you're actually not quite as close as you thought. So these things are very fluid. And the best thing you can do, I think, in general, and this is a sort of good general rule of thumb for getting unstuck, is to ask the right questions, or even to ask questions at all, which sets you apart from most of the population. I think we're so mindless about these things that just saying, am I where I want to be? Am I stuck? Do I feel like I'm moving in the right direction? Do I know what my goals are? Just asking those questions and being able to answer them really sets you apart from most people.
Yeah. Would you recommend people kind of write them down periodically? Because we tend not to remember, what we were thinking a month ago very accurately.
Yeah, I'm a bit of an extremist on writing things down, it turns out. Like I have, for every single year since 2002, so 22 years, every single day, I write down a couple of sentences about what happened that day. And it's a bit different from what you're asking. But the reason I do that is because I think essentially your understanding of who you are is the sum of your memories of the past, of what you've done, who you've been, what you felt in those moments. And memory is fallible. But when you write things down, it's a really good way to jog your memory. So at the end of every year, I'll go and read, what did I do for these 365 or 366 days? And I can revisit that. And I can look at how I've changed as a person over time. And it's there in writing. It's concrete. And it's something I could revisit. So yes, I think doing things in writing in general is a really good idea because we don't remember stuff. We always think in the moment, I will never forget this moment. And then there are a million other moments that follow it and you forget. But writing helps ameliorate that issue. And I think it's a good general practice for things that are important to you.
It's also really nice. I never thought of that before, but if you write down if you know you're going to write down what you did at the end of the day, it's almost like a little bit of a feedback mechanism to not waste too much time, right? Because you're going to have to reckon with you're going to have to be honest with yourself at the end of the day, at least a little bit.
It's a really interesting question, whether it's good for you to know that you're going to write what happens down.
Right.
Because even thinking about, I don't think about it. It's just so automatic after 22 years of doing it that I don't think about it. But there are days where I get to the end of the day and I'm like, how am I going to fill 2 lines? I didn't, what did I do? I did nothing. And sometimes what I end up doing, and I think it's interesting, I think those make for the most interesting entries, because then they're about emotions. They're about things that are not like, here, let me very clinically describe what happened during the day, which is interesting on a certain level, but also a lot of days look the same when you do that. But if you say something that's, then I'll go more into like, here's a thing my kids did on this day that was different and funny and interesting and showed some level of extra maturity. And then I'll revisit that 3 years later and just be hugely emotional when I read it.
Yeah.
And that was a day when it seemed like nothing happened. And so I don't know what the right answer is there.
It's really interesting. There was one article I read by someone who was trying to advise for people that had a couple of successful TED Talks and about how to write stories. And his advice was, at the end of the day, basically what you're doing, but at the end of the day, write down one story-worthy event in your day.
Mm-hmm.
And what it seems to do is to make you more present to your day, just like you're describing. And so because you're constantly searching for that story, and it doesn't have to be a grand story. It could be a story that you tell your friend, oh, you know what happened. And it's a short little paragraph, but that makes you more present.
It's a bit like having a witness to your life, but you're the witness.
Exactly.
But there's going to be an objective point of reference.
And it sort of an omniscient witness who knows everything, because if you've written it down and you can return to it, I essentially can look down from above at 22 years of my life. I don't know what happened before 2002 because I wasn't doing this yet, but it's amazing what a kind of richness and texture it brings to your memories that I would not have otherwise. If you ask me, I could probably tell you one thing about each year between 2002 and 2008. And that would be one thing that defined that year for me. But actually, if I go and look at that book, it has 365 things, which is obviously a richness that we don't normally have access to.
Right. It's the granular texture that actually like makes a life rather than a few big moments here and there.
Exactly.
Friends, we hope you're finding value in the content. If you're enjoying what you're watching, please consider hitting the like button, help us with our YouTube algorithm, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on the notification button to stay up to date with everything going on in the channel. Can we ask you about goal gradients?
Please.
What is the goal gradient effect and why should we care?
Yeah, so it's this very interesting research that is quite old. It's almost 100 years old. Some of it actually is 100 years old. It was psychologists asking the very basic question of, when you're approaching a long-term goal, are there particular moments when we generally are predictably more engaged, motivated, and other moments when we are predictably less motivated and engaged? In other words, do you do better at certain points during an extended goal? And the answer is yes. That the early research suggested that we do better as we get closer to the goal. That when you're sort of aimless in the beginning, you haven't quite reached a point where you feel comfortable. You're like, I don't know where I'm going. And this is not just true of humans. If you put a mouse in a maze, the mouse goes slowly at first and then it figures it out and it kind of rushes towards the goal. And humans do that too. There's a huge amount of evidence. Even things like loyalty programs. If you go to the same coffee shop, how long does it take you to get 10 stamps to get the free coffee? Slowly at first, and then you speed up towards the end. So that's the original goal gradient effect. The newer effect suggests that actually a lot of the time you start fast, you end fast, and there's a lull in the middle. It's kind of U-shaped. But they both findings basically suggest that there's no consistency in how we approach goals. And the reason that's such an important idea is because for most of the things that matter to us, they are long-term, and there are going to be lulls in motivation. And so that suggests certain fixes and ways of reconstructing goals, for example, by shortening them into smaller chunks to remove that middle where there tends to be a lull, to improve our progress towards the end goal in general.
It's so interesting because when we were talking about that particular topic, and in medicine, we see patients and we see them recover from a particular ailment, and usually we see musculoskeletal issues. And so we do a procedure, let's say we send them to physical therapy. What we see is sort of the inverse of that curve.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the beginning is difficult and it's slow. And then it speeds up and recovery reaches a particular peak kind of speed of gains, and then it slows down and tapers as you get closer to 100% for a variety of variables. But it seems to be an inverse of that. But I think that probably is just more specific to recovery of a physical body rather than motivation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I think so. There's something binary about the goals I'm talking about here. It's like, does the mouse get to the cheese? Do I earn the salary I care about? Do I, get the girl? Whatever it is that matters. It's a kind of binary yes or no. And so as I get closer to it, it's drawing me in. I think recovery after, say, surgery or something like that, I think that's not binary. And you can feel better day to day. And also there's a sort of asymptote there. Maybe not always, but often, are you going to be perfect? Maybe not, but you're going to sort of approach that. And as you get closer to being where your potential recovery level is, there's probably going to be a slowdown in the gains that you're going to make as you approach that goal. And that makes total sense in a lot of different contexts. In the goal context where it's binary, I do think you see this attraction to the end state as you get close, only because now it's so tangible. You can almost taste it. And that's what draws you in.
And I'll tell you, I think now that you put it this way, it actually makes sense as one of the variables as to why people, because we deal with, let's say, spine issues, and what tends to happen is the goal is not to feel better. Most of the times the goal is not to feel better, but the goal is to go out and play golf. The goal is to play tennis. And so what tends to happen is actually exactly what you're saying, is that as they get to 90%, they're rushing towards that and giving up any gains, and that slows down their progress. So that actually falls right in line, because it all depends on how we define the goal of that recovery.
That's a really interesting insight. Yeah, the difference between functional goal achievement and actually, physiological wellness there's a big difference there. They don't care about being 100% as long as they're on the golf course.
Sure.
Which then undermines physical wellness.
Yeah. Right. And that's really nice.
Interesting.
So how do we avoid these midpoint lulls? What are some good strategies to not get complacent in the middle?
Yeah. So the implication is that most goals, say you're writing a book. I like this example just because it's so numerical. You're writing 100,000 words. Maybe you feel energized when you're writing the first chapter, which is, say, 8,000 words. And then maybe the last chapter, you feel energized, which is another 8,000 words, which leaves you with 84,000 words where you don't feel that way. So how do you fix that? Well, one thing you can do is you can reward yourself along the way. You break the goal into smaller chunks. This is known as narrow bracketing. And you can do this artificially. It doesn't have to be a case where you have a number of words or chapters, but you could take any goal and say, even though I ultimately care about this final endpoint, 100,000 words, a completed book or whatever it might be a journey you're on, it doesn't really matter. You can break it down artificially and say, I'm going to make this 10 sub goals. And the benefit of that is each sub goal has a beginning and an end, but it has a shrunken middle. So when you add up all those sub goals, you're spending more of your time on the big goal at either beginning points or end points when you're more energized, and less time in these lulls, and you're truncating the lulls. That tends to work really effectively. There's a lot of evidence that people work faster, animals work faster when they've got these kind of intermediate points to aim for along the way. So I think that's one really effective thing we can do. And it's probably the single most effective thing you can do with protracted goals, is to turn them into a series of smaller goals.
It's funny. It's on a sort of at the end extreme of that. We've talked to a number of Navy SEALs who during Hell Week, they talk about, the goal is to get through the week. Yeah. But what they really do is they shorten that down to the next 20 seconds.
Right.
Like literally just like, how do I just, get to the next rest period, get to the, get through the next burpee, et cetera.
And I'm a runner, and that's the same. It's the marathon it's either 26 miles, which is overwhelming, or it's, I don't know how many thousands of steps, 40,000 steps. And when you're in the pain cave, it's one step at a time. When things are going well, the steps glide by, and you start to think about the journey as 26 miles, and then you're capable of handling that. But it's too much to chew when you're really struggling. So that makes total sense to me.
Yeah. Speaking of marathon, because I know the marathon is tied in with this with this finding that you have, which was really interesting. So for me as Zinovy, we're entering the end of a decade of life. We'll be 30 soon. Well, 50. Look, the number.
End of a decade. Let's just
Right, end of a
That's
decade.
another decade. Yeah.
But it turns out that as you enter the end of a decade, we're prone to these existential crises. It's a really interesting, it's going to hit everybody. Could you talk about that? That's I mean, I certainly, there are some findings that are just kind of delightfully surprising. And then when you think about it in
Yeah.
your own life, you're like, oh, yeah, I guess, right. Okay. Please.
Yeah. There's a handful of findings from my work that feel like that kind of phenomenon where once I thought about that idea, I realized that it was something that was both surprising and true, which is sort of what you're looking for in a finding. And I think this one's a good example of that. So I'd done some reading of some early psychoanalysis work where these psychoanalysts had said, very famously, there's a midlife crisis. And if you look at creative output they were focused mainly on creative men, but this is true across the board. You see this dip in creativity as people approach the age of 40, suggesting that people are having this kind of existential crisis. It's very Freudian, very psychoanalytic. And what I realized was that actually 40 looms large because it's just a big part of our culture. We talk a lot about that age, but there's no inherent reason why 40 should be special. This should be true about any real landmark that forces us to consider the passage of time. And that's what happens with the end of the decade. Because we count using the base 10 system, when I'm 29, I think a lot more about the passage of time than when I'm 25, when I'm in the middle of my decade, because I'm reminded that that first digit is about to change to a 3. So 29, 39, 49, 59, and so on. These are years that for people inspire, I won't say crisis because it's not true for everyone, but it inspires a lot of introspection. So you see in one of the results we have that if you go to millions of people across the world and you ask them, to what extent do you consider the meaningfulness of your life? Has it brought you purpose and meaning? You see a spike in that question, in the extent to which people question that when their age ends in a 9, 29, 39, 49, not just 40 or 39, but all of these decades between 29 and 59. And you then see other consequences that are quite fascinating, because when you have that experience of reconsidering your meaning, the meaningfulness of your life, if you think your life is meaningful, then you could continue on the way you were. But if not, you might have a crisis. So you see a big rise in some things that are very adaptive. You see a rise in first-time marathon running, people wanting to read books about aging and being more thoughtful about the passage of time and how they can prevent aging prematurely and things like that. So all of that is arguably good for you. You also see a rise in extramarital affairs at those ages, and you also see a small rise in suicide. So these are obviously maladaptive behaviors, but they're all inspired by the same rise in introspection about whether life has been the way you hoped it would be.
It's fascinating. Is there a way you think people can have more positive reactions to that contemplation?
Yeah, I think people flail because they don't know the science of how you create meaning. Now, there are certain ways that humans can predictably create meaning in their lives. And if you know that, then you can go out and do the thing that's important to you and that will actually create meaning. One of them is having a goal. So the reason people like to run marathons is I think they intuitively understand that having a long-term goal, say training for 4 to 6 months for a race, having that race be this kind of benchmark and this, milestone day for you when you actually have the race itself, and then having completed the race, having that sense of celebration, that is very meaning driving. It creates a lot of meaning. So that's a good thing you can do, is create a goal. Another really big one is to create social connection or foster social connection. That can happen 2 ways. You can either deepen an existing relationship. So if you're say you're overworked and exhausted and you have a partner, you could say, hey, look, we're like ships passing in the night, but let's try once a week to really connect. We'll have a date night, or we'll watch TV together 3 nights a week, or whatever it is that helps you connect at the level you can connect. So social connection is another one. And even just understanding that, the creation of goals, social connection, development of mastery, trying something new, something you've never tried before, learning a new language, learning a new skill, woodworking. It really doesn't matter what you like to do, but any of those things will create meaning automatically. And I think you can create meaning. You can also destroy meaning by going out and, doing the other things that are negative. And I think when we're flailing and we don't know the answer, we're much more likely to do the maladaptive thing than the adaptive thing.
Yeah. It's probably a good time for journaling too. for people to reflect on these
Yeah.
things and put their values and priorities down.
Right. Absolutely. It's a very good time. And a lot of people do this at the end of every year. So that's another example. The end of year effect, which is like the miniature end of decade effect,
Yeah.
where October, those days between Christmas and New Year, between the 25th and the 31st, a lot of people are really introspective during that time. And that's where we get all of these New Year's resolutions as this turning the new leaf and so on. So turning over a new leaf and trying new things in the new year. That's
Yeah.
all part of the same basic effect.
We talked with Roy Baumeister, who recommends doing one resolution at the end of the year, because if you do too many, you're likely to let them slide. But if you pick one, you have a good chance of actually sticking to it.
Totally agree with that.
What are lifequakes? And how can we orient to them and prepare for them?
Yeah. So lifequakes by definition are almost all of the time hard to prepare for or hard to predict. You can prepare for them, but you can't predict them very well, just as you can't predict earthquakes. So a lifequake is a major life event. It can be positive or negative. They tend to be negative more often than positive, but they can be positive. And these lifequakes arrive often unexpectedly and then shape or shift a major area of your life and force you to change. So they make you stuck. And to move forward, you have to change something that perhaps was working fluidly before. And they can be good things. They can be things that you invite into your life. It could be something like getting married, having kids. It can be the death of a loved one, a major illness, which obviously is negative. And again, you don't necessarily invite them into your lives, but they arrive. What's interesting about them is that when you ask people about the course of their lives, they often sort of assume, again, a sort of linearity to life that isn't true. And the evidence suggests that we have lifequakes, these major lifequakes, maybe once every decade or so, whether they're good or bad, moving to a new place, getting a new house, all these kinds of things. And even knowing that, even anticipating that these things are likely to happen throughout your life is a big step towards being able to cope with those changes when they arrive. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that people in particularly East Asia, countries like Japan, China, and South Korea, they are better at this because they are more open to the idea that life shifts, that there's a sort of balance, the yin yang Taoism, there's the day and the night and the seasons shift. And that's a big part of the sort of Eastern philosophy. We tend in the West to hew to a more sort of progressive, everything's going to get better philosophy that leads us to be blindsided by challenge. And so lifequakes are harder for us to cope with. People in the East deal with them better in general because they are prepared for them.
I think that I heard you say, and it's certainly rang true to me, that in the West, we have this, we sort of have sanitized life, right?
Yeah.
To the point where we kind of put sickness and death off to we try not to think about it, put it to the side. And we think we can control things a lot more than sometimes we can.
Right.
And that's a big part of this.
I think that's right. I think the supremacy of science and medicine and the extent to which we, I think quite rightly, revere the sciences as kind of tools that guide us out of what might have been sticking points for the population 100 to 200 years ago. But that also has caused us to feel a sense of maybe dominion over the world that isn't appropriate, that it goes too far. If you are someone who hews to religion and you think that actually there is this kind of higher being and that higher being is just hard to predict, and what that higher being decides is hard to predict, there's not much I can do about it, I just have to cope with it, then you're much more open to the idea that life's going to throw curveballs. But if you think that, hey, we've mastered everything, look at the way we kind of control disease and look at vaccinations, look at all this stuff that's unbelievably positive.
Right.
But if you overgeneralize, you stop being open to the idea that things can go awry. And I think that can be dangerous.
That's actually, it's funny you say those examples, because I think COVID was a perfect example of that, where
Exactly.
people all of a sudden face to face with mortality in a way that they just didn't think was possible necessarily just a few months previously. Have you found that in religious communities, they are more, they respond better than non-religious communities?
Well, that's one of the big arguments about Eastern philosophy, that it's a cultural soup that if you happen to immerse yourself in, it recognizes that things are constantly shifting, that there is balance, that there is constant change, good and bad, light and dark, etc. And so that's the philosophy that I think is most carefully studied, but I could imagine this in other religious communities to some extent. Although there are some religious communities that believe that as long as we do the right thing, we will be rewarded, which is also a kind of delusion, I think, at a certain level. That's dangerous as well. So the nice thing about the Eastern philosophies is that I think they give up a sense of control that we in the West hew to very strongly. And that's wise, is recognizing that you can't control everything. You can't be infinitely righteous to avoid all bad things. That's not how Eastern philosophy works. But I think some of the religions that are dominant in the West do suggest, hey, if you behave the right way, God will spare you. And that's dangerous.
Yeah.
There seems to be some resurgence of stoicism, right? At least an increase in popularity. And the stoicism in the Western world, at least, comes close to that, right? Because there's concept of, love your own fate. And the whole idea of fate in itself is outside of your control, right? And that means that unpredictable things will happen, and the best you can do is be prepared for the fact that they're going to happen, even though you can't prepare because you don't know what that may be.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that stoicism is a great way of dealing with the bad things when they do happen. But there's also a sort of preparatory phase. I don't know if stoicism really addresses this as much, but to say that there is a chance that fairly soon, at some point in your life, you're going to need to be stoical or stoic. You're going to need to harden yourself against challenge. And that's a useful preparatory stance to take before you even have to be a stoic. But yes, I think stoicism has got this sort of renewed energy in the West, especially among certain communities. I wouldn't say it's universal. I think a lot of men in particular have started, especially young men, and then a lot of male influencers online have started talking a lot about stoicism. I think it's a very kind of powerful and masculine ideal that a lot of men in particular, consistent with the CrossFit generation and all of that it's a very appealing way of thinking about the world and grappling with the world. And I think it makes a lot of sense to a lot of people.
Yeah. Sometimes it's funny to see the videos, or sometimes we get patients who come in and they say, I got hurt. Like I went to CrossFit to get better, and look, I got hurt. Yeah. And that's not always seen as part of it, right? That is part of it. I mean, you're going to hurt as part of building the muscle, but sometimes you need to be careful, and you will get hurt, and that's a setback, and you need to work around it and get back into it. That is part of stoicism in itself, as if you really encompass the whole concept of it.
Yeah, I think the danger of overgeneralizing stoicism is that you don't pay enough attention to when what's hard is a signal that you should do something different. You grit your teeth when you shouldn't be. So I think there are times, especially when you're training the body to get stronger or the mind to get stronger, it's hard. And in those moments when it's hard, you can either keep pushing, or you could say, hey, I'm getting the signal that maybe I'm about to injure my rotator cuff. I should pull back here, speaking from experience. So that's a useful thing. And if you hew to stoicism too closely, and it's sort of this treasured sacred idea, I think it could be dangerous because you overgeneralize that. And it's important to sometimes say, maybe I need to pivot a little bit.
Yeah. And speaking of influencers online, I've been glad to see more and more people talking about the importance of recovery.
Yeah.
That's what I've noticed. I mean, because because it's on the one hand, especially when you're young, it feels like weakness to take a day off. I think we've all been there at least a little bit. But on the other hand, it's so important. Sometimes you make your best gains on the day off, right? You need that day.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, my philosophy towards running has shifted, and the big shift was probably 6 or 7 years ago when I was running. Every time I ran kind of hard. Like I would run intensely and fast, and it would hurt. And then I'd get to the end of the day and I'd be tired the next day. And I started reading much more on 80-20 running and maffetone running and all these kinds of running that say basically 95% of the time your heart rate should be in sort of a zone 1, zone 2 level. And not everyone agrees with that, but I'm not trying to win races and I'm not trying to be a world record holder. But for long-term gains and for longevity, I found that to be an incredible shift that's been very, very rewarding, and it prioritizes recovery. And it's been great for me.
We talked with Stu Smith, is a former Navy SEAL who now trains people in fitness to get ready for different kinds of special forces and stuff. And he also talks a lot about what it's like to be sort of, fit and 50 and over, right? So, how the training emphasis, needs to shift, and also depending on your goals, like you said, if you're not trying, you just want to be durable,
And if you
Right.
look, and
It's
in fact,
different.
if you looked at a number of different sports and sort of the culture around those sports, like let's say boxing, if you look at the countries where a lot of the really good boxers come from, amateur boxers, not gold gloves, but Olympics, they usually spar at about 80%. They don't
Yeah.
go all out. Runners also about 80%. In martial arts like jujitsu, a lot of the
Yeah.
great practitioners come from Brazil, where their culture is they play. They play role and they can turn it on, but majority of the time they spend in this lower intensity, reducing
Mhm.
the reducing
Mm.
reducing the kind of the injury likelihood, and also increasing the creativity because you're not pushing too hard.
Yeah. I've spent some time with professional coaches, and I think what they're always trying to find the balance between is going too easy where you don't prepare yourself for the battle of competition. That's a problem. You don't want to experience hardships for the first time during competition. And then building up that sort of longevity over time where you get stronger and stronger and stronger. And obviously the worst thing that could happen is you have a long-term injury. So then that's massively counterproductive. So they're always trying to work out, how do I build confidence and make sure the body gets stronger and faster and more effective? But also, if I push too hard and go too far, then there's the likelihood of injury, but also you have to expose the body to some hardship. And so overtraining sometimes is also valuable. And so it's this constant tussle between those two endpoints.
Right. And then sort of doing cycling, meaning
Yeah,
cycling on and off, doing a little bit of hard and then
right.
allowing yourself to recover. And there's a
Exactly.
lot of a lot of value in that.
Yeah.
Um, can we?
Can we pivot?
Yeah.
Creativity.
Yeah.
Can we pivot to
Please.
creativity? Something that we were really happy to read in your book is that there's a sense that most successful entrepreneurs, especially like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, are going to be 20-something wonderkins
Right.
like the Zuckerberg. But that turns out not to be true. Could you talk about that? That was a really interesting. The whole chapter is really well. We've got a lot of questions there, but could you start with
Yeah.
the entrepreneurs?
Yeah, it's a similar insight to the what we talked about earlier on, which is that the stuff that gets the most attention in writing, in film, in the media, in books and so on, it's the stuff that's interesting and surprising. And so it's overrepresented. So people love writing books about young prodigies. It's fascinating to see that a 7-year-old chess player is a grandmaster by the age of 9. That's really interesting. But there are thousands of grandmasters for whom that's just not true. They take a long time to get there. It takes hours of practice. But we don't spend as much time focusing on them because they're the background. They're the kind of noise in the background. And that's true about precocious talent in general. It's fascinating to us when someone can do something at a younger age than what you'd expect. So Zuckerberg, his story is well told often and over again because it's such an interesting story. It makes this idea of achieving feel very democratic. It's this idea that, you don't need to go to college. You can drop out of college and be successful. If you have the right good idea and you have the right kind of orientation towards it, you can succeed too at a very young age. But actually, when you look at the data, when you do look at the background and you do look at the actual numbers, what you find is that across tons of different disciplines and domains, there is massive value to being seasoned and experienced. And it's not surprising on a certain level, but I think given the background of what we see so much and what we are exposed to, a lot of people are surprised to find that out. So there's that idea that if you're not successful by 30, you're not going to be successful at all.
Yeah,
And that's just not true. A lot of people only attain success later in life.
yeah. It's an inspirational story for you know the rest of us.
The majority of us.
The majority, but also it kind of makes sense. Like when we started the medical practice, I remember saying to a friend of mine, it wasn't really as hard as people said it was going to be, I thought. And he said, yeah, but you have to realize like you've spent 30 years harnessing
Yeah.
a skill and now you're taking it to market. But, it's not like you just opened up a box and, it's like there's been a lot of work behind it that then goes into the actual opening. So when I thought about, yeah, well, like a 40 or a 50-year-old or, like someone close to 50, there's a lot of experience that can't easily be recreated unless you've lived it.
Yeah, I think it's a big mistake to sort of think of experience too narrowly. Like if you want to be a particular kind of medical specialist, or you want to be a particular kind of lawyer, or you want to become a particular kind of investment manager, whatever it is, you want to specialize, there's a tendency to think that you have to develop very narrow, very specific, very tailored skills. But there's a lot of work now that suggests that there is a huge amount to be said for these very domain general skills that cut across disciplines, that to be a good, orthopedic surgeon, you need a lot of the same skills that you need to be a good corporate lawyer. And you develop those skills over time. They are in the background of your life, generally coping with hardship, generally getting unstuck across time, generally being creative and finding creative solutions. That's valuable no matter what you do. And you can't come by that using shortcuts and hacks. You just have to live. And so for most of us, that life, that 20 or 30 years of experience, even though you don't realize it at the time, is unbelievably valuable. And so universally, when you ask people at the age of 45 or 50 or 60, when you look back at yourself at 20, what do you see? They say, I was a kid. I didn't know what I was doing. And so really that kid is kind of accidentally stumbling on good ideas maybe occasionally. But really, we're much better at discerning the great ideas among the not so good ones when we're 40 or 50 or 60.
Yeah. It is, by the way, a great reason. I mean, it's one of the great services of a book like yours is that if people can, read it and absorb some of the lessons early and start implementing them, you build off of that, right? And then you don't have to make quite as many hard-earned mistakes. And, instead you can practice better coping skills sooner, hopefully.
Ideally, that's the hope.
I mean, look, you can really extrapolate this to society at large in the sense that if you think that the norm is to be most creative and most successful in your 20s, there's absolutely no reason to respect the elders. And, if you start to recognize the reality of life and the reality that it's been recognized over the millennia past, and there is a reason why we respect our elders, because there's wisdom. And there is, I think it was Mike Mullane, the astronaut that we talked to, who said, wisdom is expensive. Wisdom is sweat and blood, and you need to respect that. You need to respect what it takes to get there, and you need to respect those that have it. And so, yes, that your book can extrapolate to that. You can change the society at large.
I think that's such an important idea, that success teaches us almost nothing. You learn almost nothing from being good at things and sailing through. And what you learn is almost entirely from those moments in between that we maybe don't want to talk too much about and that we don't focus much on, but it's the hardships. It's the struggles, it's the pivots, it's doing things in a different and new way. And if you never had that, if you had a perfectly charmed life, I think it's impossible to develop wisdom. Like, how do you know what's good versus bad, what's right versus wrong, if you haven't had those wrongs and bad experiences and hardships along the way?
I have to bring up the cultural reference that, what I'm going to say? Yeah. There was a sitcom, I think it was in 30 Rock. There's a really good looking guy who's a doctor, and everyone just keeps on telling him everything he says is right because he's so good looking. And so he has all these crazy ideas that, either you see this or am I just, but anyway, it was, but it was sort of that, like he never got to develop a real character for himself because everyone was so eager to please him because he was such a good looking guy that, that's it's sort of a jokey version of that though, that you need to have those hardships.
It's interesting you say that. I was doing research, not for this book, for my previous book, which is about the rise of screens and how much time we spend on screens. And when I was doing that research, I spoke to a guy who said to me that one of his friends is a very famous actor, very, very good looking famous actor who's, widely looked at as the kind of ideal for what a physical specimen should look like. And so the two of them would go out sometimes in New York City where they spent a lot of time together, or in LA. And this guy I was interviewing was like, it's an amazing thing to watch this guy, because from the outside, everyone wants to talk to him. Everyone wants to be his friend. Everyone wants to tell him how great he is. Women love him. He has no trouble finding partners and so on. But when you talk to him, he's like, it's sort of a silly thing. It seems like a silly thing to complain about, but he's like, it's so unbelievably demotivating to get exactly what you want all the time. You develop no character. It's boring. The things that kind of present challenges and that make life interesting for other people, he's like, I could have exactly what I want at all times. And honestly, you will never understand this because you don't look like I do. But it is a curse. It's hell. And, obviously everyone's like, yeah, sure. That sounds terrible.
You will get no sympathy.
No sympathy. But there's a kernel to that, which is that it's not good for building character and feeling fulfilled to always get what you want.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a
That's really funny. But you can totally, it's funny how also you can identify that that is probably absolutely true and correct. And
Yeah,
also, I don't want to hear
exactly. Yeah, that describes 80% of my research.
it. Yeah.
it's a really interesting concept when you think about, like, I would love to have written that book,
Mhm.
but in reality, it's who do you need to become to be the author of that book, and then how do you get there? And that is by writing the book and by struggling
Right.
with all the yeah.
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 Our son started getting into chess tournaments, and I've noticed that all the tournaments they have these it's just written everywhere on all the little like paraphernalia you see, like it says win or learn, right? So it's, in other words, it's just
Love
what
it.
you're saying, right? You're either going to win or you're going to learn something. There's no
Right.
losing. It's just progressing, or you did a, or in some ways not. In some way, if you win everything, you didn't really progress, but it's
Right.
still good. But
Also,
anyway,
there are no movies that don't have some hardship, right? We find that boring. Like
yeah,
we can't watch a movie where there's absolutely no challenge. Can you imagine watching a movie where it's someone who has an absolutely perfectly charmed life, and you
right,
get to the end of it and you're like, what did I just watch? There was nothing there. There was no challenge. There was nothing to overcome. Every traditional narrative arc has a hardship in it. It's the
yeah,
only way to make films, to make stories. There has to be frustration. And so I think that's right. I think not only is that true in entertainment domains, but I think it's really just true about being a human being.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. And you don't feel fulfilled unless you've overcome. I think Jordan Peterson would say like slaying the dragon, right?
Hmm.
Unless you find a dragon, slay that dragon, you don't really feel fulfilled.
Right.
Yeah.
That's why I've gone out of my way not to look like that. Oh, there was also an interesting finding that you had where when people were trying to, I forget, perhaps you can fill this in for me. When people were asked to think of like 10 words or something, with the beginning, with, 10 unique words with a certain letter, they do that. And then you say, okay, find 10 more. And
Hmm.
they think, no, I've given you my best, but the next 10 turns out to be more interesting than the first 10, which is just a great story for perseverance for people.
Yeah, it's not my own research. It's research on a concept known as the creative cliff illusion. And the idea is that we believe our creativity will fall off a cliff if we try to be creative for too long. So, for example, if I say to you, you have a new business, come up with business names. You've got to name your business. And you say to people, do you think your business name, the best, most creative business name, will come in the first 10 ideas you have, or in the second set of 10, ideas 11 to 20? And almost everyone intuitively says, well, it gets hard and then it gets bad. So the good stuff tumbles out of my head. That's the most creative and interesting stuff. And then, ideas 11 to 20, by that point, all my good ideas are gone. I've kind of expended my energy. And that's the creative cliff. You fall off a creative cliff, but it's an illusion. And it's an illusion because actually those first ideas, everyone can have them. They hew to the herd. They're kind of boring. They're not particularly interesting. It's when things start to get hard that they start to get interesting, because then you diverge from the way you normally think about things and how other people think about things. And that's why ideas 11 to 20, if you persevere to that point, they may be difficult to come by, but they will tend to be more creative and interesting.
It's actually, and that kind of bleeds really nicely into the next thing I was going to ask you about, which is your name. The story of your name is so interesting. We can all recognize it. I started thinking about how we named our own kids, and I started wondering, are we going to see a whole bunch of Laura, Milas, and Lucas?
Mhm.
Could you tell that story? I think a lot of people would find that really helpful.
You mean the sort of trap of trying to find a perfectly unique
Exactly.
name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a similar idea, I guess, about the power of the herd and about background to set how you think about things. But the basic idea is that when you are trying to name a child, if you are trying to find a name that kind of goes in between very obvious and chosen by everyone, and also not so unusual that no one will understand it or be able to spell it or be able to remember it, that's the way most people name. They're sort of trying to find this kind of middle road. And it can be very broad, right? They can have a big latitude for that. You can go anywhere across that spectrum. But what we often try to do is to come up with something that's unique and different enough that not everyone in the classroom is going to have the same name. And my parents tried to do that with Adam. What you see is I was born in 1980. They came up with my name in 1979, 1980. 1980 to 1982, there's this massive peak where everyone was named Adam. Like there were tons of Adams out of nowhere. And my parents were blindsided by that. They were like, we had tried so hard to find an unusual name. And actually we looked around and no one was named Adam in the 70s. It was a very unusual name. And they actually just knew one guy named Adam and they were like, that's a great, fairly unusual name. Obviously there's Adam in the Bible and so on. And it's not totally unheard of, but it's unusual. But unfortunately, they were not the only ones doing this thing where they said, hey, there's, a couple of Adams around. That sounds unusual. And they're all swimming in the same cultural soup that makes them all think the same thing. And so you can get this peak at the same time. And so you can kind of miss the mark a little bit. We often think we're being divergent, unusual in what we're choosing, but so do other people. And you end up finding that you've kind of fallen into that trap.
Yeah. It's so, on the one hand, humbling to realize that we think we're being so unique. And the other thing you mentioned in the book is, people take pictures, and I did something similar, pictures of their feet on like a canoe.
Yeah.
Right. And then it turns out there's like, tens of thousands of the same image that everyone's doing the similar thing, thinking, yeah, it's a really, but it kind of made me think two different sort of like, it's sort of a paradox. Like on the one hand, it increases the value of wanting to go outside of your comfort zone and go do different things, because in that way you're being exposed to not the normal cultural soup, and you can actually consider yourself a little bit more original, while at the same time as the whole society becomes more homogenized, it's harder and harder to do that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I really love, I heard it somewhere. It's, you're unique, just like everyone else.
Exactly.
Is there a way out of that, do you think? Is it just to say the same kind of thing? Look, I'm going to take my first 10, throw them out, and I'll go to my next 10?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing to do is to think about what your inputs are. So if you're naming someone or you're coming up with creative ideas, try to figure out introspectively where the inputs to those outputs come from. Like if you're saying, I think my parents knew that there were certain Adams. There were some famous Adams at the time, and I think they were part of the reason why these names became suddenly popular. There are great examples of this. Like in France, the TV show Friends was very popular, and suddenly everyone was named Phoebe and everyone was named whatever the other characters were on Friends. So if your input is the input that's widely available, there are going to be some other people who see the same things and think the same things. But if you are someone who seeks out, like you don't just go to the New York Times bestseller list and read the same 5 books that everyone's reading. And you don't just watch the same movies everyone's reading, but you actually actively strive to do things that are different. Maybe you travel to a country that not everyone is going to. Maybe you read 5 books that not everyone's reading. Then your inputs are different and your outputs are going to be different as well. But if you keep doing the thing that's popular and that's common to everyone, you're going to look a lot like them.
But isn't there a bit of a potential danger in that? And danger probably is too strong of a word to say here, but I think we heard you speak about the unique names or more common names, and the difficulties that people with unique names may come across in their careers, let's say, as an example, right?
Yeah. So this, I think you're asking the question: is it better to have essentially a unique name or a fluent name? Is that the idea?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because if you go, because I can imagine an example where I go to Greece and I love Greece, and there I meet this guy that I've never heard that name, and that's how I name my child.
Right.
And then we're in the United States, and I think I heard you talk about a law firm and someone trying to make partner, and they have this unique and difficult to pronounce name, and that may work against them.
So there are different reasons that we use when choosing names for children in particular. When you have kids, one is cultural reasons, like you want to express a certain part of your culture that's important to you and your kids, and that might mean choosing a name that's more, say, unusual in the context of where you happen to live. And that's totally fine. That's a defensible decision and it makes sense. Other people say, hey, I want to choose a name that will maximize the likelihood of my child succeeding. And I don't care about culture and other factors. I just want to pick a name that's going to make my kid appealing and more likely to succeed broadly. That doesn't have to go against the cultural naming trend. But what the research suggests, or at least my research suggests, is that if you have a name that people can pronounce, that is familiar, that is understandable, and that they can say fluently, there are advantages to that. One of the advantages is they don't have anxiety when trying to pronounce your name and are more likely to affiliate with you. If you're at a law firm and there's a partner and there are two potential associates that they're choosing to work with, one has a name that the partner cannot pronounce, one has a name the partner can pronounce, as a tie-breaking option, they're going to pick the one they can pronounce just because they're anxious about pronouncing the one. It's not like malicious. You're not a terrible person. That's just how humans work. So there's some value in striving for fluency over uniqueness in naming, I think. But that's not to say you should do that at the expense of what is sort of meaningful and important to you. It's just an additional factor to take into account.
This is, by the way, I think one of the unsung heroes of psychology writ large is that the way you just presented that is it's obvious that they're going to pick the person whose name you can pronounce, but I could easily imagine a world where that's not the finding. The finding is if you have a unique name, you stand out. So of course you're going to think of the unique name because the unique name is different than all the other names. So that's why the research is so interesting, because it's not obvious before the fact, right? It's just that, but then you find what it is, and then that's the finding. So that's why you do the research.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think both are true, right? So if I meet 100 associates and 99 are named Adam, and then there's one with a unique name, and then you ask me in 6 months, do you remember you met 100 associates over the summer? Who do you want to hire? You're going to pay a lot more attention to the one that's not named Adam.
Right.
So there's value in uniqueness, especially retrospectively in long-term memory. I think a unique name will stand out, especially if you're trying to disentangle, who was that? Which Adam was that? That's obviously problematic. But in the moment, if these two people are standing in front of me, either literally or metaphorically, and I'm trying to decide who am I going to work with, the anxiety that comes from not knowing how to pronounce someone's name is, in a very sort of real and concrete and immediate sense, a problem that you're going to have to grapple with if you choose that person. And so that's going to be the tiebreaker.
And as probably as a just an easy takeaway for people with unique names is the fact that there is some anxiety associated with it, and to introduce themselves loud and clear, or tell them that it's okay to be called something else. And I'm speaking from experience, yes.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Not a thing goes by that I don't get an additional letter thrown in, or people will hesitate to say something, and I know very well that there is that anxiety associated with it.
Or you could do my father-in-law's name is Dragomir, and he was working in corporate America, and he said, "My name is Mark." Just because it was just made everybody exactly what you're saying. Everyone, take a breath. Call me Mark. Okay.
Yeah, that's a very common approach. If you want to pick a shorter name, an easier name, that makes total sense. The other option is to say, I don't want to do that, but then to do exactly what you're suggesting, which is to say, the first time you introduce yourself, it rhymes with this, or something, some mnemonic that helps people pronounce it. And really, this is subjective. Like a name in Poland that has many consonants in a row that would be foreign to Americans, to Polish people might be totally fluent and pronounceable. So it's very context dependent. A good example of this, I think, is if you look at the US presidents, we've got Joes and Donalds and Rons and Georges. And then in the middle there, we have Barack Obama, which, as names go, is objectively more disfluent in this culture. But by the end of his presidency, after 8 years, Barack Obama was an incredibly fluent name because we'd said it and heard it and thought about it so many times. Yeah. So you can turn something that's disfluent into something fluent through exposure and through, again, giving people a bit of a hint about how to pronounce it or spell it.
Speaking of that, there's almost definitely going to be a flood of Baracks coming down the pike.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Can we pivot to miscommunicate? There was something that you wrote about communication problems that as a married person of close to 20 years, I found really interesting. You were talking about the sort of the small miscommunications that happen that can really lead to big problems. And you were saying how, for example, a glass in the sink that you leave and either you wash or not, either it's just a glass in the sink that someone's got to wash, or it's a test of the other person. Like, are you going to help me because you relate to the fact that I had a hard day, and so you're going to take it up? And how do you know when the miscommunication over a glass in the sink is a big deal, or are you perseverating over something important, or is this just a trivial glass?
Yeah, I mean, I think one really good cue is how many times have you been asked about the glass in the sink? So a lot of people will say things like, I am earning money and I am with my kids a lot of the time and I'm all these big things, I do all these big things. And so, yes, I'm asked 100 times, nagged 100 times to take the glass out of the sink. And that's trivial compared to all the many things I do for this family. And I think that's a very common response. It's a particularly masculine response as well. But what it misunderstands is that it's not about the glass in the sink. It's about understanding what that actually represents to the person asking you. To, in this case, if it's your wife, it could certainly be a husband. But if your wife is saying to you, please take that glass out of the sink, by not doing it, it's not demonstrating that you don't think that's an important glass in the sink, that particular narrow thing is important. You're demonstrating something much broader. And I think that's what we mistake. We often think that by not listening to a request, as trivial as it may seem, that we're just signaling the importance of that particular narrow domain. But what we're actually doing is signaling the importance of the person's request and what it means to them, and that we find it trivial. So if you're asked something many times, or if you know something is an issue for your partner and you just sort of just brush it over and don't think it's important and think that you're not conveying much, you're actually conveying much more, which is that what really matters to them, what's important to them, is not that important to you. And that's I think, a major cause of conflict in relationships.
This just reminded me of another there's a sitcom called Everybody Loves Raymond.
Yeah.
And there's an episode where they come back from a trip and somehow one of the suitcases gets left on the middle landing, like half up the stairs, but not all the way. And then it just stays there for like a week or two. And they keep on, I think it was Raymond keeps talking about it, like, no, I'm not going to take it. And then finally someone says something about it and they just blow up because they've obviously all been thinking about this suitcase that's representing something much larger than the suitcase.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly the point. That these small things, these things that seem trivial in relationships, are often representative of something much larger. Like, you didn't take the glass out of the sink, therefore you don't care about me and what matters to me in my life. It's a bit of a stretch. You might say, hey, I didn't remove the glass from the sink. That's not what I'm trying to say. I care about you very much. But to the other person, you're effectively sort of spurning them as they ask you for something, even if it's trivial, that might be important to them.
You think that if that's the case, then there's probably something larger looming underneath the glass that needs to be addressed?
Probably, but I think that's true about a lot of relationships, that often the kind of surface level discussion is about a bigger underlying thing. And it doesn't mean that every relationship is in jeopardy or that it's in trouble. But I think in every relationship, there are underlying issues that are bubbling under the surface to some extent. And they are represented in surface ways that depart from the actual thing that's going on. I love that there's this video that's been viewed, I don't know how many times, 30 million times now. It's a short video. It's 2 minutes long, and it's the best 2 minutes of relationship advice I've ever seen. It's called "It's Not About the Nail."
Oh,
and
yeah.
You know this one?
You showed it to me yesterday.
I just literally after
our family.
It's amazing because it encapsulates so much, in this case, about how men and women see their roles in resolving what seem to be problems. And it's this woman who's sitting, she's got a nail, like a kind of carpentry nail embedded in her head. And she says to her husband, I've been feeling so much pressure in my head and I have such a headache and my sweaters keep getting snagged. And he's like, well, yeah, you got a nail in your head. Just move. How about, I think if we remove the nail, you'll be okay. She's like, you don't understand. You don't understand me. You're not showing me the kind of care that I need. And he's like, well, just remove the nail. We won't need to care about anything else. It'll be fixed. And that's not what she's looking for.
Right.
And what's fascinating about this video is how differently men and women come to view it. And it's not universal, but I've shown it to a lot of my male and female friends. And it's surprising how often the man sees things the man's way, the woman sees things the woman's way. And it's only 2 minutes long, but it does an amazing job of demonstrating what men and women are often looking for. And I don't want to boil it down simply to gender, but these gaps in communication that happen in any friendship or relationship.
Right. The reason that came up for us yesterday was I was saying how our oldest daughter, she's 15, and she'll come home now from high school and she'll talk about something. Now I've learned to say, is this the kind of conversation where we're trying to fix something, or am I empathizing?
Yes.
because I put on like a little different hat, and I can kind of make myself calm down if I'm empathizing, or if it's go time, then we're fixing something, But yeah, it's a perfect nail example.
It's a great question for getting unstuck in those conversations, is understanding what your role is. I think that's smart.
Yeah. Something I liked a lot, if I'm pivoting again, we prefer $1,000 today to $1,280 next year, even though we can't get the 28% return, right? We tend to prioritize today. And it seems like a lot of that is because we're not connecting to our future self. We're not seeing ourselves there. And you mentioned a study where when people are hypnotized, and told to connect or to imagine their future self, then they make better decisions for the future. How can we connect, since we're not all going to get hypnotized?
Right.
Are there ways that we can connect to our future self so that we can make better choices for our future?
Yeah, so I was involved in this work. We brought in a real hypnotist, a trained hypnotist, who hypnotized a whole lot of 20-somethings, people in their early 20s, and said to them, so you are now, this is the first day of your retirement. And so for many of them, this is like 40, 50, 60 years down the line. And I want you to imagine, some of them are told, you've got to imagine that you don't have what you need. Like all you want to do is, or whatever you like doing today. Do you like playing golf? Do you like traveling? Do you like eating good food? And you don't have enough money to do those things. So you're now, in the later stages of adulthood, you're an older adult and you don't have what you want. How do you feel about that? And these 20-year-olds are crestfallen. They are devastated. Like, I feel terrible. I'm so upset. And remember, they're hypnotized to believe they're actually 65, 70, 80, whatever they are. And when they snap out of it, when the hypnotist says, all right, wake up, or whatever he says, I can't remember how it works, it changes fundamentally how they think about allocating resources between today and the future. Now, the reason we don't do that automatically is because it's so hard for us to imagine in our 20s and 30s what it might be like to be 60 or 70 or 80. We think of those people as completely separate entities, the way you might think of yourself as separate from another human being, like you're completely different, distinct beings. And what the thing that hypnosis does is it bridges that gap immediately and very powerfully and viscerally, so that you say, oh God, it would be horrible to not have all those things that I really know I'm going to want when the time comes. Now, as you say, not everyone can be hypnotized, but you can still go through similar exercises. You can ask yourself the same question. Like imagine it's the first day of retirement and you don't have what you need. And most people, by the way, if you like playing golf in your 20s, you're going to want to play when you're retired. If you like eating good food, that's not going to change that much. These things that are priorities for us tend to be fairly consistent. So ask yourself what it's going to feel like not to have those things. And even getting people to consider just how much overlap there is between themselves today and who they will be in the future does a pretty good job of getting us to prioritize saving for later. It's just that most people don't intuitively do that.
Do you have any idea how long that different mindset change lasts for after the hypnotist, for example?
Yeah. So what happens is, obviously they're no longer hypnotized, but what it does is it shows them the emotions of not having what you need. And the fact that just because it's in the future, the distant future, doesn't mean that it's not going to hurt when it arrives. So what they do is, it's not like they say, I'm going to save 100% of my income today so that when I'm 65, I'm not going to be sad that I can't play golf. That's not what happens. But what it does is it shifts them in that direction where they say, all right, I got $1,000. Formerly I would have taken $10 for my future self, 1%. But now I'm like, I don't know if that's going to get me where I am. If nothing else, I should speak to a financial advisor and figure out how I can play golf when I'm older, which is the whole point of this exercise. But it also shifts them to saying, well, maybe I should save $100, or maybe I should save $150. I don't know what the number is, but it's certainly higher than $10.
Yeah.
And so it's a shifting of priorities, because we so naturally prioritize the here and now, the present, that getting us to shift is very difficult. And that's because of the remoteness of the future. It always feels like it's uncertain. I don't understand who I'm going to be, what I'm going to look like. One of the other great manipulations is to get people to wear virtual reality glasses where they are in a room where there's a mirror. A friend of mine, Hal Hirschfield, did this research. They're looking at a mirror, and half of them see their present self in the virtual reality world. The other half, their face is put through aging software that makes them look 75. And they see the 75-year-old version of themselves in the mirror. And then after the experiment, they're asked, okay, so you just were in this room, this virtual reality room. How much money would you save and how much money would you spend today? And the people who see this older version, it doesn't feel so remote. And so they say, I would save more for my retirement.
Yeah. Yeah, you really have to make it come alive for the
Exactly.
person. Um, yeah, it really brings out that the more we can just take a few quiet moments to consider those questions, the better off we're going to be in the long run.
I think there's value in a book that just says, here are the 100 or 1,000 questions you should ask yourself once a year, or even breaking it down, saying these are the questions you should ask every day. These are the questions you should ask once a week. These are the questions you should ask once a
Right.
year. Maybe that'll be my next book.
There you go.
But that's, I think that's so much of being human and falling short is just not knowing where to even begin. Not so much what the answers are, but just
Right.
knowing to ask the question in the first place.
Right.
Well, knowing how to ask right questions. I mean, it goes down to some of the games that are coming out right now, like Esther Perel, about relationships, and she comes out with this amazing game for relationship. And all
Right.
that is really just gamifying, just asking the other person about their earlier or deeper experiences, and just deepening your, just knowing how to answer those questions. And she gamifies it, which
Mhm.
makes it appealing, and it's something that we do. We're not just talking, and it's a guided exploration.
Exactly. I think
Yeah.
that's a perfect example of that idea.
Yeah.
Well, I would definitely buy that book. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I endorse it.
I'm thanking you for saying you'll buy a book that I'll probably never write, but I appreciate it.
I'll send you the advance.
Okay, there you go.
Um, okay.
Always.
When we get stuck, you say that sometimes the best thing to do is to do less rather than try and just push through. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think that's always true, but I think there's a sort of human tendency to flail when you're stuck, and physically, if you're stuck physically, that makes a lot of sense. You want to get out of being physically stuck, and humans are great at dealing with that. There are these amazing cases of hysterical strength, they're known as, where someone picks up a car off a person and they're like, I don't know where I got the strength to do that. Humans are amazing, and with enough adrenaline, we can do incredible things. Unfortunately, that same adrenaline is counterproductive when you're trying to be thoughtful and strategic and considered about your next step. Now, the idea is that if you're stuck, the dominant action is not helping you, because otherwise you wouldn't be stuck. You would have just kept going smoothly in the direction that you were headed before. So what is required more than anything is a pivot, is a shift. And if you are just acting to act, you are unlikely to make that pivot or shift. You're going to just keep doing the dominant thing, and you're going to further entrench yourself. So the argument is not so much that you shouldn't act ever. It's that the next thing you do should probably not be acting. It should be dealing with the emotional consequences of being stuck and then thinking strategically about alternatives. And that's why the book that I wrote is structured such that it talks about action last and starts with the emotional components of being stuck and then the mental components of being stuck. And then we can talk about action. So action's important, but we often rush to act before we have been thoughtful.
Yeah. There's a great, I really like the Chinese finger trap that you
Yes.
describe in the book. Can you describe that? I thought it's such a great pictorial representation of what you just said.
Yeah, the Chinese finger trap is you can buy them actually. I bought a whole lot of them. They're made of paper or bamboo.
That would be
And
the worst
basically-
class ever.
Yeah, exactly.
You
So
had
I all my students have to wear one, and then if they can't get out, well, that's their lives now. Unfortunately, your hands are attached to each other. But it's you put your two index fingers inside either end of this sort of cylinder, and the tendency, and this was originally I don't know if this is true or apocryphal, but there was a Chinese emperor who would ask his potential advisors to put their fingers inside this trap, and the human tendency when stuck is to flail, is to pull apart. Like if you don't want your fingers to be inside the trap, the best thing you can do is to pull. But actually, the way the trap is structured, the more you pull your fingers apart from each other, the more entrenched you become. The tighter the trap becomes, the more likely you are to hurt your fingers. What you've actually got to do is relax and push inwards. So give in to the effect of the trap, and then the whole thing loosens and you can pull your finger out. And then you're no longer trapped. And so the beauty of this idea and the metaphor, I think, that's so powerful in the context of this Chinese emperor finding an advisor is, if you flail, you are of no use to him. If you are someone who is able to say, hey, this is unpleasant, I don't like what's going on here, but I'm going to slow down and lean into the discomfort, then I'll figure out a way through, then you're the right kind of person. And in general, I think getting unstuck flailing is unhelpful in the same way as pulling apart your fingers in the finger trap is unhelpful. It's a really nice sort of visual metaphor.
Yeah. And now we know if we see a bunch of college-age kids walking around with their fingers, we'll know what happened. When the fingers travel, we'll understand what happened.
It's been months for some of them. I feel bad, but they got to learn.
They've got, we gotta let them.
We ask
We're looking at the time. This is
because we've
yeah. I mean, this could go on. This.
Yeah. Oh wow.
Yeah. It's not. We're not. We're not messing around. We got pages.
We've got on page 3 of at least 10 pages.
But it was your work is. I mean, really. We didn't get to the boards. All right.
But also speaking of which, that you were just talking about your next book that you're never going to write. You kind of have written at the end of this book.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's an amazing toolkit.
Oh, the list, the 100 ways to get unstuck. Yeah, it is a kind of, it's an unusual thing that I hadn't done before, but I sort of decided that I think a lot of bad talks, when you go to a talk, especially as an academic, you sit through a talk, the worst talks, they talk about all the research. They're like, here's my new idea. And then they spend 20 minutes concluding and you're like, I'm ready for lunch. I'm out. And the best talks say, and here's the last good idea I have, and here's a 1-minute summary, and then you can all go. And I wanted the book to be that. So I decided for this book that the epilogue would be a sort of summary of the big ideas in the book, and it's called 100 Ways to Get Unstuck. It's sort of the summary of the techniques and tools that I describe in the earlier part of the book. And I was kind of worried about doing it because it's so different from the way most epilogues work. But I think based on the responses I've got, it's been very well received, and it's sort of been an interesting message for me about how to construct epilogues and how to tie up a book.
Yeah, I thought
it's wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the worst thing is to read a very insightful book and be left with, okay, that was great. What do I do now?
Right.
Right.
What was that point? And the thing is, you can't just read that list, I feel like, and be like, okay, I got it.
Yeah.
Like, you have to have the context of the preceding chapters of the book. And then when you just read that one line, it reminds you of what you talked about in the book. And it's like, yeah, I think you might be a trendsetter on that one.
I don't know. We'll see. But I appreciate it. Thank you for saying that. I was worried about it, but it seemed to be effective in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. Maybe we can have you back sometime to get the next 26 pages of there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Friends, thank you for your attention. We hope you've enjoyed the conversation. If you find value, please remember to hit the like button and help us with our YouTube algorithm. Consider subscribing to the channel and turn on the notifications so you can stay up to date with everything going on with the channel. And please leave us a comment. Let us know what you thought about the show and also what you'd like to hear about in the future.